The rescue party had prepared themselves for the worst. That was the job. That was what you did when you rode out after 3 days of the kind of cold that killed without apology and without preference. You prepared yourself for bodies. You prepared yourself for the particular stillness of a room where the fire had gone out and the people inside had gone out with it. Thomas Mercer had been doing this work for 11 years across the Dakota Territory, and in that time he had learned how to carry the weight of what he expected to find before he found it. He had learned how to keep his face steady. He had learned how to say the things that needed to be said afterward in that flat, careful voice that people used when the words themselves were not enough, but silence was worse. He had not learned how to prepare for the smell of bread. It came through the door before anything else, before the warmth, before the sound of voices, before the sight of 9 people alive and sitting on a floor that should have been frozen solid. The smell came first, rolling out into the -40 air, like something from another world entirely. From a world where ovens existed, and women stood in kitchens and the ordinary business of living continued without interruption. Mercer stood in the doorway of that 12 by 14-foot tar paper shack on the morning of January 15th, 1888, and he could not move. The men behind him were equally still. One of them made a sound that was not quite a word. Inside the shack, in the gray winter light that came through a single greased paper window, a girl was kneading bread dough on a wooden board. She was 15 years old. She had dark hair pulled back from her face. She turned when she heard the door open, and she looked at Mercer and the 6 men behind him with an expression that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to people who had not seen it. It was not surprise. It was not fear. It was something closer to the look of a person who had been expecting company and was simply noting that the company had finally arrived. Behind her, near the far wall, a young man sat reading a book. He was 18, tall and lean, with the quiet of someone who had learned early that most conversations were not worth the words they cost. On the floor beside a massive white structure, in the center of the room, a brown dog lay sleeping. When the cold air came in, the dog's tail moved once. It did not get up. It was warm where it was. It had no reason to move, and throughout that small room, 7 other people sat or rested on the floor. Mercer recognized faces he knew from the county. A farmer and his wife, an old Norwegian who had been in Turner County longer than most of the trees, a Catholic priest with a weathered face and careful eyes, all of them alive, all of them warm. 9 people in a space that should have held 2. Mercer stepped inside. He was not a man who was easily stopped by things. He had cultivated over the course of his life and his work a practical relationship with the world that allowed him to move through difficult situations without being derailed by them. He did not stop for things. He assessed them and continued. He stopped now. In the center of the room stood the most unusual structure he had ever seen inside a home. It was massive, nearly chest height, roughly 6 feet on each side. Built from what appeared to be handmade clay bricks, whitewashed on the outside until it gleamed in the pale light. It radiated heat the way a stone foundation holds the warmth of a summer day long after the sun has gone down. Steadily, evenly, without any visible effort, without any visible fuel, without any fire burning at all. Mercer walked toward it slowly. He reached out and placed his palm flat against its surface, warm, not hot. Warm in the way that living things are warm, constant and reliable and deeply fundamentally present. He crouched down. He pressed his hand against the earth floor directly beside the base of the structure. The floor was warm. He could feel it through his palm and through the leather of his glove, which he had pulled aside to be sure he was not imagining it. Heat rising from the packed dirt itself, steady and even as though the ground in this one small room had decided to take the side of the people who lived on it. Behind him, one of the men, a tall Swede from the north end of the county who had not shown strong emotion about anything in the 8 years Mercer had known him, walked past and stood in front of the clay structure and took off his hat. He held it against his chest with both hands the way a man holds his hat in church. Mercer turned to look at the girl. She had gone back to her bread dough. She was working it with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone performing a task she had done many times before in many different kinds of weather, under many different kinds of pressure. Her hands moved with a certainty that was at odds with everything about her situation. 15 years old, an orphan, in a tar paper shack at the edge of a claim that every sensible person in Freeman County had written off 6 months ago. Mercer opened his notebook. He would spend the rest of his life trying to write down what he had seen in that room. He would never quite get it right. Some things resist being written down. Some things can only be experienced in the moment when the cold air meets warm air in a doorway, and you understand with your whole body that something has survived that should not have. He did not know yet how it had happened. To understand how it happened, you have to go back 6 months. You have to go back to August of 1887, to the heat and the dust and the particular grief that travels with two young people who have buried both their parents within weeks of each other and are still moving because they do not know how to stop. Wilhelm Brauer died on June 14th, 1887. He was 42 years old. He had been a farmer in the old country where his family had been among the German colonists who settled in the Ukraine under Catherine the Great, and a farmer in the new one where he had come with his wife and children, seeking land of his own on the American frontier. He had wanted land the way some men want money, and others want recognition with a deep and unqualified desire that shaped everything about the way he moved through the world. He had died of typhoid fever in eastern Nebraska 17 days before he was to stand for the first time on the 160 acres of Dakota Territory that bore his name on a government claim document. His wife, Marta, sat beside his grave until the sun went down. Then she stood up and walked back to where the children were waiting, and she told them they were leaving in the morning. 17 days after that, Marta Brauer collapsed in the yard of a way station south of the Nebraska border. The doctor who was called said her heart had simply stopped. There was no medical explanation that satisfied the facts. There did not need to be one. Anyone who had seen her face in the 17 days since her husband's death knew exactly why her heart had stopped. It had run out of reasons to keep going. It had done the arithmetic of what remained and found the sum insufficient. Liesel Brauer was 15 years old when she and her brother Stellan buried their mother beside a small wooden church in a Nebraska town whose name would fade from her memory within a year. She stood at the grave for a long time. She did not cry. She and Stellan had cried themselves empty somewhere in the 2 weeks before. There was nothing left. Finally, she spoke. She said they would go to Dakota. She said they would claim the land their father had wanted. She said they would never sell their grandmother's notebook. Stellan looked at his sister. She was 15. She was the only family he had left in the world. She was standing at their mother's fresh grave, with her chin lifted and her hands folded, and an expression on her face that he had seen before. It was the same expression their mother had worn on the morning after their father died. The expression of a person who has already made a decision and is not interested in being reasoned out of it. Then we go to Dakota, Stellan said. They arrived in Freeman-Turner County, Dakota Territory in the first week of August 1887. They had $43. They had a wagon that produced new sounds of distress with every mile. They had a dog, a brown animal with copper-colored fur, in certain light thin when they found him beside the road in Nebraska, recovered now to something approaching his proper size. Liesel had named him Copper. He had followed them every mile since Nebraska without being asked, as though he had assessed the situation and concluded that these were his people now. And that was the end of the matter. And at the bottom of a canvas bag wedged beneath the wagon seat, they had a small leather notebook. The cover was cracked and dark with age. The pages inside were yellowed and soft from years of handling, but the handwriting was precise and clear. The hand of a woman who had valued exactness, who had understood that the difference between a measurement that was right and a measurement that was nearly right could, in certain seasons, be the difference between living and not. The notebook had belonged to their grandmother, Marta Brower, the elder who had lived her entire life on the Ukrainian steppe and had raised 9 children through winters, that the people of the American frontier, for all their experience with hardship, would not have recognized. She had written the notebook for her daughter. She had wanted to pass something useful down through the generations. She had wanted to give her children a tool that would work when other tools failed. She had wanted them to know how to stay warm. The claim itself, when they reached it, was a structure, if you were willing to call it that. The previous homesteader had lasted 1 winter and abandoned it, leaving behind a tar paper shack 12 feet by 14, with walls thin enough that daylight showed through in several places where the paper had pulled away from the rough lumber beneath. A cracked iron stove sat in one corner with the look of something that had been angry for a long time and was no longer trying to hide it. The floor was packed dirt. The single window was covered with grease paper in place of glass. It let in light of a kind and kept out wind only partially. Liesel stood in the middle of the single room and looked around at all of it. Then she looked out through the greased paper at the flat Dakota landscape stretching away in every direction, brown and enormous and indifferent. The nearest timber was 40 miles away. The nearest coal was available at the Freeman supply store at a price that would consume their remaining $43 in approximately 5 or 6 weeks. She did not show Stellan what she was thinking. She rarely showed anyone what she was thinking. But she stood there for several minutes, and she did the arithmetic, and when the arithmetic was finished, she walked back out to the wagon and lifted the canvas bag from under the seat and took out her grandmother's notebook. Cecil Holt arrived on the 3rd day. He was 50 years old, the land agent for Turner County. A man who moved through the world with the particular assurance of someone who had never been seriously inconvenienced by it. His coat was clean. His boots were clean. He had the manner of a person accustomed to being deferred to, and he carried himself accordingly with a slight forward lean that communicated that he was busy. And this visit was one of many, and he had already formed his conclusions before arriving. He walked around the exterior of the shack once. He looked at the cracked stove through the open doorway. He looked at the two young people standing in the yard, a girl of 15 and a young man of 18. Orphans, both of them recently arrived from Nebraska with a wagon and a dog, and nothing else that was immediately apparent. He opened his leather notebook and wrote something without looking up. Survival prospects, he said. None. I will recommend this claim be reassigned by spring. Liesel stepped forward. We will be here in the spring, she said. Her English was careful, each word placed with precision, the English of someone who had learned it as a second language and had not yet acquired the habit of being careless with it. We will be here in every spring after that. This land belongs to us. Holt looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled the particular smile of a man who found the confidence of young people charming and irrelevant in equal measure. He put on his hat. He mounted his horse. He rode back toward Freeman without another word. Liesel watched him go. Stellan said, "How?" It was not exactly a question. It was more the sound of a person confronting a distance they cannot see across. She went to the wagon and brought back the notebook. She opened it to the first page of the technical section where their grandmother had drawn in precise and measured lines, the cross-section of a heating structure, unlike anything on the Dakota frontier. She placed the notebook in Stellan's hands. Not with wood, she said. Not with coal. With this. Frank Geller came on the 5th day. He was 52 years old. He had the build of the land he farmed, broad and unhurried and quiet, in a way that suggested depth rather than emptiness. He had been in Turner County for 16 years. He had survived things that the county had thrown at him, drought and flood, and the particular grinding difficulty of plains farming in a decade when the weather could not be trusted. He had survived things, and he had lost things, which is a different kind of experience, the kind that teaches you things that survival alone cannot. He rode up and stopped his horse at the edge of the yard and looked at what he saw. He saw the shack. He saw the cracked iron stove visible through the open door. He saw two young people, a girl and a young man, who had the look of people who had been doing the kind of work that erases the distinction between exhaustion and determination. He saw Copper sitting beside the girl's feet, watching him with the calm appraisal of a dog who has learned to trust his people's judgment about strangers. You cannot winter here, Geller said. Not with that stove, not with those walls, not with just the two of you. Liesel had heard this 4 times already in 5 days. She had heard it from the land agent and from the man at the supply store and from a woman at the church and from the driver of the wagon that had brought them out from the railroad. She understood that it came from experience. She also understood that the people saying it had no solution to offer alongside it. Only the observation that she was in danger, which she already knew. How much wood, she asked. For winter, Geller told her. 8 cords, minimum 10 to be safe. He told her what hauling cost from the nearest timber. He told her the price of coal per ton at the Freeman store. He told her what a family needed to survive a Dakota winter in a structure like this one, all of it adding up to a number that was more than twice what they had. He watched her face while he talked. He had expected to see fear. He had expected the tight-lipped determination of a person who is frightened and unwilling to show it, which was the most he had seen from anyone, In a situation like this, he did not see that. What he saw instead, and what he would think about for months afterward, was calculation. She was doing arithmetic behind her eyes. She was measuring something that was not the distance between herself and defeat. "I have seen winter beaten before," she said when he finished. "Not with wood, not with coal." He waited. She did not continue. She did not have the English to explain the rest, and she had already concluded that explaining it to this man would not help her and would cost time she could not spare. She thanked him for coming. She went back to what she had been doing. Geller rode home. He rode home thinking about the girl's face. He rode home thinking about the calculation he had seen in her eyes. He rode home past the Freeman churchyard, which he passed every time he came from that direction. And he looked as he always looked at the small stone near the east wall. The stone was simple. It bore a name and 2 dates. Ellie Geller, 1874 to 1881. His daughter. She had been 7 years old. She had been a girl who laughed at things he had not thought were funny, which was something he had always considered one of her better qualities. The ability to find joy in places he had not thought to look. She had died in the winter of 1881, a 3-day storm. The iron stove in the bedroom had consumed the last of its fuel sometime in the second night and gone cold. By the time the storm broke and Geller could reach town for help, it was too late. He had replayed the sequence of those 3 days more times than he could count. He had replayed the sound of her breathing in the first night and the sound of it in the second night, and the difference between those 2 sounds. He had replayed the moment the stove went cold. He had replayed every choice he had made in the weeks before the storm, every cord of wood he had not split, every preparation he had not completed, everything he might have done differently and had not done. The stone in the churchyard had not made him hard. It had made him honest in the particular way that loss makes some people honest, stripping away the comfortable assumptions they had carried before and leaving only what was actually true. What was actually true was that an iron stove in a 3-day Dakota storm was not enough. He had learned this at a price he would not pay again. He had learned it in the worst possible way. And now he was watching 2 young people prepare to bet their lives on the exact same iron stove, in the exact same shack, in the exact same county where he had learned that lesson. He did not sleep well that night. He did not know yet what was in the girl's grandmother's notebook. He did not know about thermal mass or masonry stoves or the 300 years of knowledge that the German colonists of the Ukrainian steppe had spent developing and refining their understanding of how to make heat last through the longest nights. He did not know about any of that. But something in him had registered the calculation behind the girl's eyes, and it would not let him rest. Liesel opened her grandmother's notebook that night, after Stellan had fallen asleep, and Copper had settled at the foot of his blankets. She sat on the dirt floor in the thin light of a single candle and read what her grandmother had written in the careful, precise German that was the only language the old woman had ever needed. The notebook had been written for a daughter. It had been written by a woman who understood that the knowledge she carried was not guaranteed to survive into the next generation without being committed to paper. Because knowledge that lives only in the hands and the memory is vulnerable to the 1,000 accidents that time arranges. Marta the elder had watched too many useful things disappear when the people who held them died without passing them on. She had not allowed that to happen with this. The system she described was not complicated in its principles, though it demanded considerable skill in its execution. The people of the Ukrainian steppe, and before them the Russians from whom they had learned, and before them others stretching back further than written record could easily trace, had long ago understood something about heat that the American frontier had not yet learned. They had understood that the problem with fire is not producing it. The problem with fire is keeping it. An iron stove takes wood and turns it into heat that rises immediately toward the ceiling and then out through the chimney. You get warmth for as long as the fire burns. When the fire stops, the warmth stops. In a 3-day Dakota blizzard, this is a problem that cannot be solved by simply having more wood. Because there is never enough wood, because wood is heavy and expensive, and there is always a point at which you run out. The answer that the people of the steppe had arrived at through 3 centuries of cold winters and accumulated understanding was thermal mass. You do not heat a room with fire. You heat a mass of clay with fire, and then you let the clay heat the room. Clay has a property that iron does not. It holds heat. A dense mass of fired clay brick, properly constructed, properly configured with the right channels running through it, to slow and capture the heat on its way from the firebox to the chimney, will absorb the heat of a hot fire burning for 20 minutes and release it slowly and steadily over the following 18 to 20 hours. The fire goes out. The clay does not cool for nearly a day. It radiates that stored warmth at body temperature, gentle and constant, heating the air at the level where people actually live, warming the floor beneath your feet, keeping the room at a temperature that allows survival, not for the hours that a fire burns, but for the day that follows. Liesel had first seen her grandmother build one of these when she was 11 years old. They had spent a summer morning mixing clay and straw in the yard of the farmhouse, the old woman guiding the girl's hands in the mixture, checking consistency not by measuring but by touch, by the particular way the clay held together when you rolled it between your palms. This is how our people outsmart the cold, her grandmother had said, not by having more than the cold has, by being smarter than it. She had been 11. She had understood it the way you understand things at 11, as something true and interesting that belonged to the world of adults. Something she filed away in the part of her mind reserved for knowledge she did not yet need. She needed it now. She read through the notebook carefully. She read the dimensions of the firebox and the specifications for the channel configuration, and the ratios for the clay and straw mixture, and the notes on brick thickness and the observations about firing technique. She read it twice. She read certain sections 3 times. Then she set the notebook beside her on the floor and sat for a while in the candlelight, thinking about what the land around her was made of, and what she had seen that afternoon when she walked to the low ground near the creek. The next morning, before Stellan was awake, she walked half a mile to the creek bank. The soil along the water was blue-gray and dense, the kind of clay that farmers despised because it stuck to everything and made drainage impossible. She pulled up a handful and pressed it. She rolled it. She bent it. She checked the way it held its shape. She pressed it between her palms the way her grandmother had taught her, feeling for the particular resistance that indicated the right composition, the right density, the right potential. It was not exactly the clay she had worked with in Ukraine. The color was slightly different. The feel was slightly different, but it held its shape. It bent without cracking. It had what it needed to have. She stood at the creek bank in the early morning of a Dakota August and held a handful of clay in both hands. And she thought about her grandmother mixing clay in a farmyard on a morning that must have felt something like this one, warm and ordinary, with the work of the day just beginning. Close enough, she said to herself, in German. Close enough. She walked back to the shack and woke her brother. The work began that day. Stellan did not understand what his sister was proposing. He was a practical young man. He believed in things he could touch and verify. Iron stoves existed. They were in every house he had ever been in. They had been manufactured somewhere by people who understood their business. A stove built from clay and straw, and the memory of a 15-year-old girl working from a notebook, written by a woman who had been dead for 2 years, existed at this point only as an idea. But he had no better idea. And his sister had a look in her eyes that reminded him powerfully and without comfort of their mother. So he dug. He dug clay from the creek bank for 2 hours every morning before the heat of the day settled in. He dug clay for 2 hours every evening as the light was going. He carried it back in buckets that became heavier with every trip as the clay packed down and the water drained out. His hands blistered and the blisters hardened. And after 2 weeks, the hardening began to feel like something earned rather than something suffered. Liesel mixed the clay with straw she cut from the edge of the prairie, and with dried manure she collected from the field behind the shack. Ingredients that would have seemed unlikely to anyone watching, but that combined in the proportions her grandmother had specified. To create a brick material that was dense and workable and capable of surviving the repeated cycles of heating and cooling that a working stove would put it through for years. She built wooden molds from scrap lumber. She began pressing bricks one after another, laying them out in rows on the flat ground to dry in the August sun. The rows grew longer each week. By mid-September, they covered most of the yard. Copper watched all of this with the calm interest of a dog who has decided to trust his people and is simply monitoring to make sure nothing unexpected occurs. He lay in the shade of the growing rows during the hottest part of the day. He walked beside Stellan on the trips to and from the creek. At night, he slept beside whichever of them seemed to need company more. People noticed the bricks. People talked. This was the nature of a small plains community in a territory that was still new enough to feel provisional, where everyone knew everyone else's business, because everyone's business was potentially everyone's problem. Dorothy Marsh rode by one afternoon in late August. She was 45 years old, a widow with the expression of someone who had seen enough of the world's capacity for difficulty to recognize its patterns from a distance. She stopped her wagon at the edge of the yard and looked at the rows of handmade bricks for a long time without speaking. Then she clicked her tongue. "Poor thing," she said. "Building something out of mud. All alone, and they've lost their minds." She rode on. By the next week, everyone in Freeman had heard some version of what Dorothy Marsh had said, embellished in the way that small community stories are always embellished, so that by the time it reached the far side of the county, the Brower children had gone fully mad and were attempting to build themselves a pyramid. Walter Breck came by with 2 friends on a Saturday morning in September. He was 25 years old, loud and entirely confident in the accuracy of his opinions about everything. He stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the rows of bricks and the half-constructed frame of the stove, taking shape inside the shack and laughed out loud. $5, he said to his friends. $5 says they do not make it to Christmas. His friends took the bet. Father McCready came in early October. He was 55 years old, an Irish priest who had come to the Plains territory a decade earlier, and had stayed because the work was endless, and because he had arrived at an age where restarting elsewhere required more energy than he wanted to spend. He had a weathered face and cautious eyes, the eyes of a man who had learned to be careful about things he did not understand. He walked among the rows of drying bricks. He looked at the shack. He looked at the structure taking shape inside it. He looked at Liesel for a long moment. "What is this?" he said. "A stove," she said. "It does not look like any stove I have seen. It is not from here. It is from Ukraine. From my grandmother." Father McCready's eyes narrowed slightly. He had heard about knowledge that came from old countries. Some of it was wisdom. Some of it was something else. And this knowledge he said carefully. "Where did your grandmother come by it?" "From her grandmother. And her grandmother's grandmother before that. It is 300 years old." 300 years, the priest repeated. He was doing arithmetic of his own backward through time, calculating what 300 years ago meant in terms of when and how the church had come to those lands. Liesel understood what he was suggesting. She had heard variations of the same concern from people in other forms in other languages throughout her life. "The cold does not care about the church," she said quietly. "It only cares about physics. And physics says that clay holds heat 20 times longer than iron." Father McCready looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head and rode away. The following Sunday, in his sermon, he spoke about the danger of trusting old knowledge from pagan lands over the providence of God. He did not name the Brower children directly. He did not need to. Niels Strand came near the end of October. He was 72 years old, the oldest Norwegian in Turner County. A man who had come to Dakota Territory 30 years earlier and stayed because there was no other place that felt like home. He was tall and thin and almost entirely silent on most subjects. He walked with the deliberateness of a man who has learned that hurrying is usually a mistake. He stood in front of the half-built stove for a long time, his eyes moving over the brickwork and the channel openings and the proportions of the firebox with the attention of someone who was reading rather than looking. Then he turned to Liesel, and his expression was not the skepticism she had become accustomed to, and it was not belief either. It was something older than both of those things. It was recognition. "I saw one of these in Bergen," he said quietly. 50 years ago, before I came to America. An old man had built one. They called it the Russian stove." Liesel felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope. Something more precise than hope. The recognition of not being alone in something. "My grandmother called it that too," she said. "She said the Russians learned it from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians learned it from people who came before. 300 years of knowing how to survive." Niels Strand nodded slowly. "If you build it right," he said, "it will work. I have seen it work." He looked at her with something that might have been respect offered plainly and without ceremony. "But you must build it exactly right. The channels must be as the old plans say. The clay must be mixed exactly. There is no room for error. There is no room for error anyway, Liesl said. This works or we die. Niels Strand looked at her for a long moment. You have your grandmother's eyes, he said. I knew a woman like that once. She never stopped either. He tipped his hat and walked away. And then in the last week of October, the most important visitor arrived. Karl Vogt was 40 years old. He was a brickmaker by trade, born in one of the German-Russian communities along the Volga River, the same communities that the Brouwer family had come from, built by the descendants of Catherine the Great's German colonists who had settled the steppe 2 generations earlier. He had heard about the unusual construction project from Dorothy Marsh's gossip, which was the medium through which most information traveled in Turner County. Unlike everyone else who had heard that gossip, Karl Vogt had not laughed. He had gone quiet. Then he had saddled his horse and ridden out to see for himself. He stood in front of the half-built stove for a long time. His eyes moved over the brickwork in a different way than any previous visitor's eyes had moved. He was not assessing whether it would work. He was reading it. He was reading the choices embedded in each course of brick, the angle of the channel openings, the depth of the firebox, the way the structure narrowed at the top to direct the heat where it needed to go. He turned to Liesl. Where did you get these plans? He said. His voice was strange, tight in a way that was not hostility. From my grandmother, she said. Her name was Marta Brouwer. Something moved in Karl Vogt's face. Something deep and slow, like a change in the weather seen from a distance. Marta Brouwer, he said, slowly enough that each syllable was distinct. He was quiet for a moment. In the old country, near the Volga. When I was a boy, there was a woman of that name. People said she had built more stoves than any man alive. They came to her from 3 villages away when they needed one built correctly. He looked at the stove again. Then he looked at Liesl. I can see her hands in this work, he said. You are building it exactly right. Exactly as she would have built it. He paused. But your bricks could be harder. Denser. I can show you a technique for firing them that will make them last 50 years instead of 20. It was not an offer of help from pity. It was not charity. It was the offer of one craftsman to another, made from the recognition of skill and the desire to see a good thing made better. Liesl accepted. For the next 2 weeks, Karl Vogt came every day. He taught Stellan how to build a proper kiln from the clay and stone they had available. He showed Liesl adjustments to the clay mixture refinements that had been developed in the decades since her grandmother had learned her craft improvements, that the craft had continued to accumulate as the people who practiced it continued to pay attention to what worked and what did not. The bricks they fired in that kiln were the hardest Liesl had ever held. Dense and precise with a ring when you tapped them that spoke of permanence. She held one in both hands and thought about her grandmother mixing clay on a summer morning and writing down everything she knew in a notebook with a cracked leather cover. And she thought about how the knowing in that notebook had traveled across an ocean and a continent through 2 deaths and $43 and a wagon that should not have made it this far to arrive in a tar paper shack on the Dakota Plains where it was still true, still exactly as useful as it had ever been, still capable of saving lives. The brick was warm in her hands from the kiln. She set it down in its place. There was a great deal left to build. The stove took shape across November the way certain things take shape not all at once, but in stages that each looked insufficient until suddenly they did not. You could stand in the doorway of the shack on a Tuesday and see a structure that appeared to be a collection of handmade bricks arranged in an ambitious but uncertain configuration, and then stand in the same doorway on a Friday and see something that had crossed some invisible threshold and become a thing with purpose. Liesel could feel the threshold approaching. She had felt it when she was 11 years old in Ukraine, working beside her grandmother, and she felt it now, the sense of a thing gathering itself toward completion. Karl Vogt came every day for 2 weeks, and then every other day for 2 weeks after that. And what he contributed was not just the technical refinements to the clay mixture and the firing technique, though those were considerable. What he contributed was the presence of someone who had grown up with this knowledge, who carried it in his hands the way Liesel carried it in hers, and who could therefore confirm in the wordless way that shared craft confirms things, that what she was building was right. He would crouch beside a section of channel work and look at it for a long moment without speaking. And then he would nod once and stand up and move to the next section. And that nod was worth more to Liesel than any spoken assessment could have been. Words could be politeness. A craftsman's nod was not. The channel configuration was the most critical element, the thing that separated a masonry stove from a masonry box. Her grandmother had drawn it in the notebook with the same precision she had used for everything else. The path that the heat would travel on its way from the firebox to the chimney. The turns and rises and descents that would slow it down and force it against the clay walls of each channel, depositing its energy there rather than carrying it uselessly into the sky. It was a counterintuitive design. Everything about a conventional stove pointed upward toward escape. This design argued against escape. It argued for retention. It said that the heat you generate is worth keeping, that it is too valuable to let go without getting everything possible from it first. Vogt watched Liesel lay the channel brickwork with the particular attention of someone comparing a finished thing to an internal standard. After the third day of watching, he said, "Your grandmother was more precise than most men I have trained." He said it the way you say a thing that is simply true without embellishment. Liesel received it the same way. She kept working. Bridget Quinn had been coming by since late September, and by November she was a regular presence at the edge of the work, helping where help was welcome and asking questions where questions would not interrupt. She was 19 years old, red-haired and freckled in the way of Irish women who have not yet reached an agreement with the prairie sun. And she had a quality that Liesel had rarely encountered in the weeks since arriving in Freeman. She was genuinely curious. Not curious in the way that some of the other neighbors had been curious, which was the curiosity of people watching something they expected to fail, taking notes on the manner of its failure. Genuinely curious. The kind of curious that asked real questions and waited for real answers, and then thought about those answers and came back with more questions. She wanted to know how heat moved through solid material differently than through air. She wanted to understand why the channel configuration mattered. She wanted to know what the clay mixture felt like when it was right. So she pressed her hands into a fresh batch and felt what Liesel told her to feel for. And she nodded when she understood, and asked another question when she did not. She helped carry bricks without being asked. She arrived sometimes before Liesel expected her, and stayed later than social propriety would have strictly required. Stellan noticed Bridget Quinn with the particular quality of attention that young men give to young women who are not afraid of physical work, who show up consistently and ask real questions, and do not require the world to be comfortable before they engage with it. He did not say much to her. He was not a man who said much to anyone. But he began to time certain tasks so that they would bring him back to the work site when she was present. And Bridget began to arrive at times that seemed on reflection to anticipate when he would be there. Neither of them discussed this. Neither of them needed to. The firebox was the last major element. Liesel built it from the hardest fired bricks, the ones from the final kiln batch, the ones that rang when you tapped them with a knuckle. She mortared each one with the care of someone who understood that the firebox would bear the most intense heat, that it would be the crucible of everything the stove was designed to do, and that a failure there would propagate outward through the entire system. She checked the level of each course. She checked the angles. She referred to the notebook twice and then put it away, because by this point the notebook had moved from the page into her hands, and her hands knew what they were doing. The chimney connection was last. She sealed the joint between the stove body and the flue pipe with a clay mortar she had adjusted from the notebook's specification, a modification that Vogt had suggested, based on the particular quality of the creek clay. Then she stepped back and looked at what she and Stellan and Carl Vogt and the brickwork of the previous months had made. It stood in the center of the room like a monument, not to ambition, but to the thing ambition is supposed to produce. It was nearly chest height, roughly 6 feet on each side, whitewashed on the outside, with a lime wash that Vogt had helped her prepare. In the gray November light that came through the greased paper window, it gleamed. It looked permanent in a way that nothing else in the tar paper shack looked permanent. It looked like something that had decided to be there and was not going to be argued out of it. Bridget was there that day. Stellan was there. Vogt stood near the door with his arms folded, watching with the expression of a man who has done what he came to do and is now waiting to see whether it was done correctly. Liesel built a fire, not a large fire, a small one, a double handful of twisted prairie grass, and a few dried corn cobs she had saved for this purpose. She built it in the firebox with the particular arrangement her grandmother had specified, dense enough to burn hot, but not so dense that it smothered itself, positioned to send the heat through the primary channel rather than straight up the flue. She struck a match. The grass caught. The cobs caught. The fire burned with the focused intensity of a small thing doing its full work hot and fast, without any of the lazy wavering of a fire that is larger than it needs to be. For 20 minutes, the room was entirely quiet, except for the sound of the fire and the sound of the wind outside beginning to pick up toward evening. Copper lay on the floor with his chin on his paws, his eyes moving between Liesel and the firebox monitoring. The fire burned. Then it didn't. The prairie grass was gone. The cobs were ash. The firebox was empty and dark. The room was quiet in a different way now, the quiet of something that had happened and whose results were not yet visible. Liesel waited. She waited 2 minutes, which was not long enough. She waited 5. She stood with her arms at her sides and her eyes on the whitewashed surface of the stove, and she waited. Then she walked to it and placed her palm flat against the clay. Warm. Not the warmth of residual heat from a fire that had just gone out, which dissipates quickly and unevenly. Not the searing surface heat of an iron stove in active use, which burns the hand and heats the air above head level, while the floor beneath your feet stays cold. Warm in the way that a stone wall is warm in late afternoon after a day of sun. Steady, even. Coming from within the mass of the thing rather than from its surface. She crouched down. She pressed her palm against the earth floor beside the base of the stove. The floor was warm. She stayed there for a moment, her hand flat against the packed dirt, feeling the heat rising from below where the base of the stove conducted its warmth into the ground beneath it, and the ground held it and released it slowly upward into the room at the level where people lived. She closed her eyes. She thought about her grandmother standing in the yard of the farmhouse in Ukraine on a summer morning, pressing her old hand against a freshly built stove and saying, "This is how our people outsmart the cold." She thought about the notebook crossing an ocean in a canvas bag. She thought about the creek bed and the blue-gray clay and the bricks drying in the Dakota August sun. She thought about Stellan digging in the morning dark with blistered hands. She thought about $43 and a wagon that should not have made it as far as it did. She stood up. She looked at her brother. He was watching her with an expression she recognized from childhood, from before Nebraska, from the time when their father was alive and their mother laughed at things, and the world had a different character entirely. An expression of complete trust. Not hope which involves uncertainty. Trust which does not. She looked at Bridget Quinn, who had her hand pressed against the stove and was looking at it with the expression of a person who has just understood something she has been trying to understand for months. She looked at Carl Vogt, who had not moved from his position near the door. He was looking at the stove with the expression of a man who has seen things built correctly and things built incorrectly and knows the difference. He uncrossed his arms. He nodded once. "Good," he said. He picked up his coat. Then he paused. "Your grandmother would be satisfied," he said. He put on his coat and went out into the November dark. Liesl did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the warmth under her feet was not already saying. Frank Geller came back 2 weeks later. He came on a Saturday afternoon in mid-November when the temperature had dropped to something serious, and the sky had the flat, pewter look that preceded snow. He rode up to the shack and dismounted, and tied his horse and stood in the yard for a moment looking at the chimney. There was no smoke coming from it. He looked at this for a moment with the expression of a man noting a familiar signal. And then he remembered what the girl had said. Not with wood, not with coal. He knocked. Liesl opened the door. He said nothing. She stepped aside to let him in. He walked to the center of the room and stood in front of the stove. He looked at it the way he had looked at things all his life. As a farmer looks at equipment, as a man who works with his hands, looks at the work of another person's hands, checking for the things that reveal quality and the things that reveal shortcuts. He looked at the brickwork. He looked at the whitewashed surface. He looked at the channel openings near the base and the flue connection at the top. Then he reached out and placed his palm flat against it. He held it there for 10 seconds. He did not move. He did not speak. Then he crouched down and pressed his hand against the floor. He stayed there for longer than 10 seconds. He stayed there long enough that Liesel, watching him, understood that he was not just registering information, but was doing something more with it. Something internal that would take more time than the simple act of feeling warmth required. When he stood up, his face had changed. Not dramatically. Geller was not a man whose face changed dramatically, but something had shifted in it. Something had released that had been held. He looked at the stove for another moment. Then he looked at Liesel. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. He put on his hat. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at the stove one more time. And then he went out and untied his horse and rode back toward his farm without another word. 3 days later, Liesel opened the door in the early morning to cold air and a gray sky and found on the step a bundle of twisted prairie grass. The kind of fuel that prairie families used when wood was unavailable, tightly wound, and dried, the kind of bundle that represented several hours of work in the field. There was no note. There was no name. She stood in the doorway looking at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and brought it inside. She did not need the note. She knew whose hands had made the bundle and whose feet had carried it through the dark to her doorstep. And she understood what it had cost that person, not in time or physical effort, but in the private admission it represented. The silent concession of a man who prided himself on knowing the land and its requirements, acknowledging without being able to say so directly that a 15-year-old girl had known something he had not. The bundle was not charity. It was something harder to give than charity. It was the wordless confession of a man who had been wrong and knew it, and could not yet say it out loud, but could do this much. She put it with the other grass bundles in the corner and went back to the work of the day. The winter settled in around them with the grim efficiency of something that had been patient all autumn and was now ready to begin in earnest. The temperature dropped through December, in stages, each stage lower than the last. The cold arriving in waves that the county's residents greeted with the resigned familiarity of people who have agreed to live in a place that makes no promises about weather. Fence posts disappeared under drifts. The creek froze. The road from the Brower claim to Freeman became navigable only on certain days when the wind cooperated, which it did with decreasing frequency. The stove performed as Liesel's grandmother had said it would perform. She fired it twice a day in the coldest stretches, once in the early morning and once in the evening, each fire burning for 20 minutes or so before it exhausted its small fuel supply and went out. The clay absorbed what the fire gave it and held it through the day and through the night, radiating warmth from every surface at the steady, even temperature of a living body. The floor stayed warm. The air at knee level and hip level and shoulder level stayed warm. The single greased paper window stayed clear of ice on the inside. Stellan slept without the extra layers of clothing that the previous homesteaders' journals, which they had found tucked behind a loose board, described as necessary for survival in the structure. Liesel slept with one hand occasionally pressed against the floor beside her, checking, monitoring, trusting, and verifying simultaneously. She tracked the fuel consumption in a small notebook of her own, a cheap one she had bought in Freeman in September. 2 handfuls of grass for the morning fire, 3 for the evening if the outside temperature had dropped significantly. In a typical week, they burned through what a conventional iron stove would have consumed in a single day. The bundle that Frank Geller had left on the step would last them 3 weeks. Their remaining stores would last them the winter with fuel to spare. She recorded this without comment. The numbers said everything that needed saying. The skeptics did not come back. They had made their observations and their bets and their quiet internal predictions, and they had nothing further to add until the spring, when they would either be proven right or proven wrong and could respond accordingly. The winter insulated each household in its own way, the cold making everyone more local, more contained, more focused on the radius of their own survival. Turner County was a collection of individual struggles through December and into January, each family dealing with its own version of the same essential problem: warmth and fuel and the management of both through the kind of weather that the plains could produce. Father McCready's sermon about old knowledge from pagan lands had faded from the community's memory, displaced by more immediate concerns. He had not retracted it. He had not needed to, because no one was paying much attention to abstract theological concerns when the temperature had dropped below zero and was showing no signs of reconsidering. The new year arrived quietly. 19 days into January 1888, the county woke to a gift. The gift was warmth. Warmth in January was not unprecedented, but it was uncommon enough to feel like a gift, rather than simply a fact of weather. The temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. A wind came up from the south, gentle and carrying with it a dampness that was entirely different from the dry, punishing cold of the previous weeks. It carried the particular smell of snow that is beginning to consider melting, that clean mineral scent that people who live close to winter recognize as the smell of the season beginning to lose its confidence. Liesl woke on the morning of January 12th to a quality of light that was different. She noticed it before she was fully conscious, the way sleepers notice changes in their environment before their thinking minds have assembled themselves. The light had a softness. It was not the hard, flat light of deep cold which comes off white snow with an almost physical sharpness. It was softer, slower. The light of a day that was not trying to prove anything. She rose and went to the window and looked out. The snow had sagged. Drifts that had stood sharp-edged and certain for weeks had lost their angles. The air above the white fields had a shimmer that belonged to a different temperature. She could see, perhaps for the first time since November, the brown shape of the fence line at the edge of the claim previously buried to invisibility. She felt the relief. She was not naive enough to feel the complete relief of a danger fully past. She was too careful for that. But she felt the partial relief of a morning that was not trying to kill anyone. The relief of a temporary truce. Stellan went out after breakfast to work on the fence section that had come loose in the last storm. He took his tools, and Copper went with him, the dog running in wide circles through the softening snow with the enthusiasm of an animal who has been waiting for exactly this, for a morning that permitted running in circles without consequence. Liesl could hear Stellan's voice through the thin walls talking to Copper, the way he talked to the dog when he thought no one could hear, in the comfortable half-sentences of someone who knows they are understood. She stayed inside. She added a small amount of grass to the firebox, enough to bring the clay back to its full working temperature. The stove had cooled slightly overnight, as it always did by early morning, the clay releasing its last reserves of warmth toward the end of the night. A small fire restored it quickly. She had learned the stove's rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of any living thing you spend time with. She knew how it sounded when it was burning correctly. She knew how the heat distributed itself through the room at different hours of the day. She knew by the temperature of the floor under her bare feet in the morning exactly how much fuel she had used the previous evening and whether she had made the right call. She knew the stove the way her grandmother had known her stoves, through daily attention, through the kind of familiarity that accumulates when you pay consistent attention to something important. She was thinking about the spring. In the spring, she would prove up on the land. Not legally, that would take 5 years under the Homestead Act. But she would prove something to herself and to the county that 2 young people with $43 and a dead grandmother's notebook had lasted a full Dakota winter on a claim that the land agent had written off as unsurvivable. She had been thinking about what came after, about planting, about what the soil beneath all this snow was capable of, about whether there was a market in Freeman for the kind of masonry stove she had built, whether other families would want to know what she knew, whether the knowledge in the notebook could be more than survival. She was 15 years old, and she was thinking about spring and about the future, which was itself a kind of evidence that the knowledge had done what knowledge at its best is supposed to do, which is transform a situation from one where the future is not certain into one where planning for it is reasonable. Stellan's voice came through the walls talking to Copper about the fence. She looked up from the stove. She went to the window. She saw it. It was to the west. Trouble on the Dakota prairie always came from the west. That was one of the first things you learned, the direction from which the land's worst impulses arrived. But this was not what she had been taught to look for. She had been taught to watch for clouds that moved too fast, for the particular greenish light that preceded hail, for the way animals behaved when pressure changed. She had not been taught to watch for a wall. It was a wall, not a storm system, not a bank of approaching cloud. A wall, a vertical surface of white and gray that extended from the ground at the horizon to the very top of the visible sky, solid and absolute and moving eastward with a speed that belonged to something other than weather. Weather moved with the patient authority of something large and indifferent. This moved with a purposefulness that was different from that felt almost deliberate, almost as though the thing had been somewhere else and had finished its business there and was now coming here. She stood at the window and watched it for perhaps 4 seconds. Then she was through the door. Stellan, she called. Stellan. The wind was already changing direction. The soft southern warmth swinging around to something entirely different. Northwest and hard and cold in a way that had no patience in it. No gradual arrival. No courtesy. It took her voice and compressed it and pressed it toward the ground and scattered it before it could reach the fence line where her brother was working. Stellan was 40 yards away. He looked up when he heard something. Not her name, probably just the quality of the sound, the frequency of urgency that carries even when words do not. He turned toward the shack. He saw the wall. He started running. Copper ran beside him with his ears flat against his head, the dog's body communicating without ambiguity. What his person's body was also communicating that this was not the kind of situation in which running in circles was appropriate. That this was the other kind, the kind where you ran toward shelter in a straight line as fast as you could. The wall reached them before Stellan reached the door. It did not arrive the way storms were supposed to arrive, with increasing wind and darkening sky and the progressive escalation that gives you time to make decisions. It arrived all at once. The wall simply reached the place where they were standing, and the world they had been standing in disappeared. Snow drove horizontally, not falling, but thrown propelled by a wind that had come from somewhere much colder than anywhere Liesl had yet been, and was communicating this fact with complete seriousness. Within seconds, she could not see the barn. Within 30 seconds, she could not see Stellan. She did not hesitate. She went back through the door, not to go inside, but to get the rope. It hung on a nail just inside the door frame, coiled neatly 30 feet of it. Hemp rope she had bought in Freeman on a day in early November when she had been reading through the pile of old newspapers that had been used to line the shelves in the shack. One of them had carried a story from Minnesota. A farmer who had died between his house and his barn during a whiteout, disoriented in the featureless white, walking in the wrong direction by 15 degrees until he could no longer walk at all. He had been found 40 yards from his back door. The story had registered in the part of Liesl's mind that processed information about survival quietly and without drama, the way useful information always registered. She had bought the rope the next time she was in town. She had hung it on the nail and not thought about it again, not because she had forgotten it, but because she had filed it where it needed to be. She tied one end to the door handle. She wrapped the other end around her wrist twice and knotted it. She walked back into the white. The cold was extraordinary, different in kind from anything she had felt in the weeks before, different in kind from anything she had experienced in Ukraine, which was itself a place that took cold seriously. This was not cold as temperature. This was cold as force, as intention, as the fundamental premise of the current moment. It pushed against her from every direction simultaneously. It found every gap in her clothing and made those gaps into corridors. It worked on her exposed face with the focused efficiency of something that had a great deal of time and was not in a hurry. She walked with her free arm extended in front of her, sweeping back and forth. The rope uncoiled behind her as she moved. 5 steps, 10. She called Stellan's name. The wind took the name and broke it apart. 15 steps, 20. She heard something, not a voice, something at the lower limit of what could be heard, a sound she was not certain she had heard until she had already turned toward it, a sound that could have been wind against an obstacle or could have been something else. She turned toward it. She walked 7 steps in that direction. Her sweeping hand touched something solid and warm. Copper had found Stellan first. The dog was pressed against his side in the white, not moving his body a fixed point, in a world that had no other fixed points. He had been barking into the wind, the sound lost immediately, but he had stayed. He would not leave. Stellan was on one knee in the snow, his face gray ice forming on his eyebrows, and on the edge of his scarf where his breath had condensed and frozen. Liesl grabbed his arm. She pulled him upright. He found his feet. She put his hand on the rope and folded his fingers around it and pointed back. He understood. They walked back together, step by step, hand over hand, along the rope. The rope, the only continuous thing in a world that had become entirely discontinuous. Nothing to navigate by except this one line of hemp, connecting them to the door of the only warm room for as far as Liesl knew at that moment 100 miles in any direction. The door appeared when they were close enough to touch it. Liesl got it open. Stellan came inside. He did not walk in so much as fold into the room, his legs giving up their argument once the wind was no longer an obstacle. He went down onto the warm floor and stayed there. Copper squeezed through behind him, shook himself once and pressed against Stellan's back. Liesel pulled the door shut. She stood with her back against it, and her eyes closed, and she breathed. The stove was there, radiating in the center of the room. The floor was warm beneath her feet. She could feel it through the snow-wet leather of her boots, the warmth coming up from the packed earth. The heat the clay had been holding all day, still there, still doing its work, indifferent to what was happening outside. Outside, the wind had found its full voice. It came from every direction at once, which was, what wind in a true Dakota blizzard? Did it reflect it off drifts and redirect it off structures, and came back from directions you had not expected it, so that the sound was not a single direction of assault, but an enveloping roar that the walls and the roof of the shack mediated without eliminating. Inside, the clay held its warmth. The temperature outside was falling toward 20 below zero. By midnight, it would reach 30 below. By the dawn of the second day, the county's weather records would show 40 below, with wind speeds of 50 miles an hour. The kind of numbers that the Weather Service would later use to calculate a wind chill that belonged to a different category of cold, altogether the category where exposed skin freezes in under 3 minutes. And the question is not whether a person can be comfortable, but whether they can be alive. Stellan shook. He could not stop shaking. His teeth made a sound that Liesel found alarming, a sustained chattering that spoke of a body working very hard to maintain something that the circumstances were arguing against. She moved him closer to the stove onto the warmest section of the floor, the section directly beside the base, where the heat from the clay mass conducted downward into the earth most effectively. She put his blankets around him. She put her own blanket on top of those. She crouched beside him and looked at his face. The gray was giving way. She watched it give way slowly, as the warmth from below and around began to register. His hands, which had been stiff and clumsy, began to move. Not much, but enough. Copper had not moved from Stellan's side. The dog was pressed against him with the deliberate, settled quality of an animal who has made a decision and is not going to be argued out of it. Copper's warmth against Stellan's back. The stove's warmth against his front. The floor's warmth beneath him. 3 directions of warmth, steady and reliable, working in the patient way that retained heat, works without drama, and without requiring anything further from Liesel beyond the small fire she added to the firebox at midnight, bringing the clay back to its maximum capacity, pushing the room's temperature as high as it would go. The iron stoves that stood in the corners of farmhouses across Turner County were running out of fuel. She did not know this yet. She would learn it over the following hours as people made their way one by one through the storm to the only door they knew of that might be worth reaching. She would learn it in pieces from the faces of people who had burned their chairs and their tables and their floorboards and had arrived at the arithmetic that said there was nothing left to burn. But right now, in the early hours of January 13th, 1888, Liesel Brower sat on the warm floor of a tar paper shack in Turner County, Dakota Territory. With her back against the base of a clay stove her grandmother had taught her to build, listening to her brother's breathing slow and deepen towards sleep. And she was not thinking about any of that. She was thinking about her grandmother's hands in the clay on a summer morning. She was thinking about a notebook that had crossed an ocean. She was thinking about the warmth under her hands, which had been there all day, which would be there in the morning, which did not care about the wind or the temperature or the distance to the nearest woodpile. She was thinking about what it meant for something to hold, The stove held. Outside, the storm pressed against the tar paper walls with everything it had. Inside, the floor was warm. Stellan stopped shaking at 8 o'clock in the morning of the second day. It happened the way these things happen when the body has been fighting something for a long time and finally gets enough help to stop fighting alone. Not all at once. Not with any announcement. The shaking simply became less frequent, and then less intense. And then, sometime between one breath and the next, it stopped. He lay on the warm floor beside the stove with Copper's weight against his back, and he opened his eyes and looked at his sister, who had not slept, and he said nothing for a moment. He was taking inventory of himself, checking the items on an internal list, accounting for the parts of himself that were present, and the parts that had been close to not being present. "The floor is warm," he said. "Yes," Liesel said. "How long has the storm been going?" "Since yesterday afternoon." He was quiet, processing, doing the arithmetic of what that meant, of how long the clay had been holding against what was outside. "How long will the stove last?" he said. "As long as we need it to." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face since they were children. In Ukraine, before their father got sick, before the world revealed itself to be the kind of place that would take both their parents in the span of 3 weeks and leave 2 young people standing at a grave with $43 and a notebook and a dog. It was the expression of complete trust. Not hope, which still contains doubt. Trust which has moved past doubt into something quieter and more absolute. "Then we wait," he said. Liesel put another handful of grass into the firebox. The flash of flame was brief and hot. Then it was gone, and the clay absorbed it and held it the way it had been holding everything she gave it since November. She put her palm against the floor, warm, still, and always warm. The storm outside had not changed this. The storm outside had not changed anything inside this room, which was the point which had always been the point which her grandmother had understood 300 years of accumulated knowing ago. At noon on the second day, someone knocked on the door. Liesel opened it. Frank Geller stood in the white. She almost did not recognize him. He was covered from the crown of his hat to the tops of his boots in a layer of snow that had compacted against him during the walk from his farm, which she would later learn had taken him nearly 2 hours through drifts that came up past his waist in places. His face, beneath the ice and frost, was the color of old ash. His eyes had a quality she had not seen in them before, not in October when he had come to tell her she could not survive the winter, and not in November when he had stood with his palm against the stove for 10 silent seconds and said, "I'll be damned." This was the quality that comes to a person's eyes when they have been frightened past the point of managing how they appear. She stepped aside. He came in without speaking. He walked to the center of the room and sat down on the warm floor beside the stove, the way a man sits down when his legs have made a unilateral decision about the matter. He held his hands out toward the clay surface without touching it. He sat that way for a long time. Liesel brought him water she had melted from snow and boiled over the firebox. Hot water, plain and without anything in it but hot. He held the cup in both hands and looked at the stove and did not speak for a long time. Then he told her. He told her about his wood supply. 12 cords of hardwood split and stacked over the summer. The most fuel he had put away, going into any winter in his 16 years on the Dakota prairie. He had done the calculations in September, and he had determined that 12 cords was more than enough. That 12 cords was not just sufficient, but generous a supply that accounted for error, and for the unexpected that left him room to be wrong about the winter's severity without paying for the error with anything he could not replace. The storm had buried the woodpile in its first 6 hours. Not partially buried, not covered in a way that made access difficult. Buried. 6 feet of compacted snow and ice that had transformed 12 cords of carefully stacked hardwood into a feature of the landscape as inaccessible as if it had been placed there by geology rather than by his own hands over the course of a summer's work. His iron stove had gone cold 14 hours into the blizzard. He told her about what came after that, the way a person tells a story that they are still inside of without the distance that retrospect provides. His wife, Constance, had burned the kitchen chairs first, then the bedroom furniture, then the wooden crates and boxes from the barn that Geller had dragged inside through the storm, one at a time each trip to the barn, a negotiation with the wind that he had won by smaller margins each time. Then sections of their floorboards pried up with a crowbar, while Constance held the lamp, and their son Samuel sat against the wall wrapped in everything in the house that could be wrapped around a person. Constance's hands, he said. He stopped. He was not a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. He was not a man who sat on other people's floors and stared at walls. The man sitting on Liesel's floor at that moment had been taken apart by something and was not yet reassembled. Her fingers, he said. He stopped again. Liesel did not press him. She sat across from him and waited, and let him find the end of the sentence in his own time, because some sentences require more time to finish than the words themselves take, because some sentences are carrying more than words can easily hold. We burned everything he said, finally, and then the wind picked up again, and it was not enough. He looked at the clay stove with an expression she could not fully name. It contained things she recognized: regret and exhaustion, and the particular bewilderment of a person who has done everything they knew how to do and found that it was not sufficient. But underneath those things, underneath the visible surface of his face, she could see something else. Something he had not come to her door to show anyone that had come with him anyway. The way certain things accompany a person whether they are invited or not. She thought about Ellie Geller's stone in the Freeman churchyard. The date, 1881. A 3-day storm. An iron stove that had gone cold in the night. She thought about the bundle of twisted grass that had appeared on her doorstep in November, with no name attached to it, and what it had taken for a man like this one to make that bundle and carry it through the dark and leave it without a note. Because a note would have been an admission, and an admission was more than he could manage at that point. She thought about what this winter was costing him, not in wood or furniture or floorboards, but in the interior economy of a man who had already lost a child to exactly this kind of failure, and who had spent 7 years building a life in which that particular failure would not happen again. "Tell me exactly how far your house is," she said, "and which direction." Geller looked at her. "You cannot go out there," he said. "Not right now," Liesel said. "But when the wind drops enough, I will go get your wife and son. So tell me the direction." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that she had not seen there before. Not gratitude which comes after the fact. Something more immediate than gratitude. The look of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just been offered without condition or ceremony assistance with the carrying. He told her the direction. He told her the landmarks. He told her about the fence line along the east side of his property that she could follow once she found it. He told her that Constance would be near the kitchen because Constance would have stayed near the stove even after it went cold. Because that was the kind of person Constance was, the kind who stays near the place where warmth ought to be, even when it isn't there anymore. Then he sat back against the warm clay surface and closed his eyes and did not speak again. Liesel checked the wind. She checked it by sound, standing near the door and listening to the character of what was outside. The way a person who has been paying attention to a thing for a long time can distinguish between its variations. The storm had been constant since the previous afternoon, constant, in a way that did not admit of gradation. But sometime in the middle of the second day, it had begun almost imperceptibly to modulate, not to ease, not to offer any real concession, but to breathe in the way that even the most sustained force breathes in, the way that everything with energy behind it eventually develops a rhythm. At 4 in the afternoon, she judged that the wind had dropped enough. Not enough to be safe. Safe was not the question. Safe had not been the question since the storm arrived. The question was whether the drop was sufficient to make the attempt possible, which was a different calculation entirely. And the calculation came out differently, depending on who was doing it and what they understood about what was possible. Stellan wanted to go in her place. She refused. "Someone has to keep this room warm," she said. "Someone has to tend the stove and keep these people alive until the storm breaks. That is you." She looked at her brother without apology or softness, because this was not a moment for apology or softness. This was a moment for clarity. You are better at the stove than I am now. You know its rhythms. You know how much fuel it needs and when. Stay here. Keep the fire going. Keep the floor warm. He looked at her for a long time. He was 18 years old, the older sibling, the one who had considered himself the person responsible for his sister's survival since Nebraska. He understood, standing in that moment, that the architecture of responsibility between them had been more complicated than he had recognized, that it had always run both directions. "Come back," he said. "I will," she said. Will she? She dressed in everything she owned that was warm. She took the rope coiled over her shoulder. She took the small compass she had bought in Freeman in September, one of the first things she had bought with their $43, before food, before tools, after the rope. She went to the door. Copper stood up from his position beside Stellan and moved toward her. "Stay," she said to him. He looked at her with the expression of a dog being asked to do something against his considered judgment. Then he sat down and looked at Stellan instead, and she understood that he had made his own calculation about where he was most needed. She went out into the white. The wind hit her with the force of something that had been at this for a day and a half and had not tired of it. She had been cold before. She had been cold in ways that she had thought at the time were serious. This was a different order of cold, the kind that communicates not just temperature but intent. the kind that finds your face and works on it with focused deliberateness. She felt her eyelashes begin to stick together within the first 30 seconds. She stopped twice in the first 100 yards to clear them with her fingertips, feeling the ice that had formed between them, feeling her fingers go numb as she did it, and then willing them back. She navigated by compass and by memory. Geller had told her his farm was approximately 2 miles to the northeast along the fence line she would find. If she could find his east boundary, she walked northeast by compass, keeping the needle steady, keeping her pace counted, measuring distance in her head, the way her grandmother had taught her to measure clay. By feel, through consistent attention, through the discipline of not letting the mind drift from the thing it needed to stay on. The drifts were waist-high in places. She moved through them rather than over them, pushing forward in the way that you push through water with your whole body committed to the direction, rather than one part of you trying to lead while the rest catches up. She fell twice. She got up both times with the same absence of drama she had applied to everything else, assessed what had happened, corrected, continued. She found the fence line where Geller had said she would find it. She followed it northeast. The fence posts emerged from the white one at a time, each one a confirmation that she was where she thought she was. Each one a small act of orientation in a world that had otherwise lost the capacity to orient. She counted them. She moved from post to post with the methodical patience of someone who understands that the way through a difficult thing is one step followed by another step, repeated without wavering until the difficult thing is behind you. She found the house by sound, which was the thing Geller had not told her to find it by, because he had not known it would be necessary. The house blocked the wind just enough that the sound on the leeward side was different from the sound everywhere else, a half step of reduction in the roar that was in a whiteout, a more reliable signal than anything visual. She turned toward the reduction in sound. She found the wall of the house with her outstretched hand. She moved along the wall until she found the door. She pushed it open. The cold inside was not as absolute as the cold outside, but it was cold in the way that a room gets cold when the fire has been out for many hours, and the walls are thin, and the temperature outside has been 40 below for 2 days. She could see her breath. The iron stove in the corner was dark and cold, and had the look of something that had failed at its only job and was not going to recover. Constance Geller was on the kitchen floor, sitting against the wall below the dead stove, with her knees drawn up and her wrapped hands in her lap. She was 49 years old, a Nebraska-born woman who had spent most of her adult life on the Dakota prairie, and had consequently developed a relationship with difficulty that was neither dramatic nor defeated. She had the look now of someone who had reached the bottom of her available resources and was waiting without panic and without much remaining expectation for whatever came next. Beside her, Samuel Geller was 15 years old. He had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's eyes. He was wrapped in everything that remained wrappable in the house after 2 days of burning furniture, which was not much. Constance looked up when the door opened. She did not speak immediately. She looked at Liesel with the careful attention of a person who is not certain what she is seeing and needs a moment to be sure. "Your husband is with my brother," Liesel said. "Come." Samuel lifted his head. He looked at Liesel with the eyes of someone who had been in a cold room for 2 days and had been thinking the kind of thoughts that cold rooms produce about what was likely and what was not, and what the difference between the two looked like from where he was sitting. "You built that stove," he said. His voice was rough from cold, and from whatever else the 2 days had put him through. The one everyone laughed at. "Yes. How did you know it would work?" Liesel thought about this. She thought about all the ways she could answer it, all the framings that were available, all the things that were technically accurate. She thought about her grandmother in a farmyard, and a notebook with a cracked cover, and blue-gray clay at a creek bank, and Carl Vogt looking at her brickwork and saying, "I can see her hands in this." "I didn't know," she said. "I trusted. My grandmother told me it would work, and I trusted her more than I trusted my own doubts." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "I want to learn," he said. "When this is over, I want to learn how to build something that doesn't fail when everything else does." There was something in the way he said it that was not simply the statement of a 15-year-old boy who had been cold for 2 days. It was the statement of a person who had looked at failure directly, had sat with it for long enough to understand what it meant and what it cost, and had arrived at a conclusion about what he wanted to spend the rest of his life doing about it. Something passed between them on that cold floor. Neither of them named it. Neither of them could have named it. It was the kind of thing that takes years to become what it becomes. And it had started here in a dead farmhouse in the middle of the worst blizzard, in the living memory of everyone who would survive to remember it, between a girl who had built something that held and a boy who had watched everything else fail. The walk back took just under an hour. Samuel walked on his own, leaning into the wind with the stubborn determination of someone who has decided not to be carried. Constance walked beside Liesel, and she walked the way that Liesel had seen her grandmother walk sometimes, in the last months before she died on will alone, the body following instructions from somewhere deeper than muscle and bone, from the part of a person that is not willing to stop, even when stopping would be easier. The wind came back up halfway through the return journey. The world went wide again, but Liesel had memorized the route on the way out. Not just the compass bearing, but the texture of it, the feel of the ground rising and falling beneath her feet, the place where the snow was deeper, and the place where a low rise gave a few seconds of relative shelter. She did not get lost. She did not need to. When the door of the tar paper shack opened, and Constance Geller felt the warmth come against her face, she stopped walking. She stood in the doorway with her eyes closed, and she did not move for a full 10 seconds, while the heat came out around her, and the cold pressed in behind her, and the two things fought their brief and entirely unequal battle in the space where she stood. Then she stepped inside. Samuel sat down beside the stove and pressed both hands flat against the clay and held them there. He did not move them. He did not speak. He sat with his hands against the warm surface and his eyes closed, and let the warmth come into his hands, and from his hands into the rest of him, slowly and steadily, the way the stove gave everything it gave, without hurry and without drama. Constance looked at her husband. Geller had not moved from his position against the far wall, but his face had changed entirely since she had come through the door. He looked at his wife, and then at his son, and then at the stove, and the arithmetic his face was doing was visible in a way that Frank Geller's face rarely made arithmetic visible. Then she looked at Liesel. "You built this," she said. It was not a question. "My grandmother taught me," Liesel said. Constance crossed to the stove and placed both of her wrapped hands against the whitewashed clay and held them there. The expression on her face was something Liesel had not seen before. On anyone in Turner County had not seen, she thought, on anyone in Dakota Territory in the 5 months she had been here. It was the expression of a person receiving something they had not known they needed until the moment it was given, and understanding in that moment exactly how much they had needed it. Father McCready arrived on the evening of the second day. He came alone on foot, wrapped in every piece of warm clothing he owned, layered over each other, in the way of a man who had left the house in a hurry and had dressed with thoroughness rather than dignity. His lips were blue at the edges. His face had the look of a man who had been walking into a Dakota blizzard for long enough to stop thinking about whether it was a reasonable thing to do and simply continue doing it because continuing was the only option that remained. Liesel let him in without speaking. He sat down on the warm floor near the stove and did not speak for a long time. He held his hands toward the clay surface. He looked at the floor. He looked at the people in the room, alive and warm, and he sat with what he was seeing. Then he looked at Liesel. "I said something in October," he said, "in my sermon, about where your knowledge came from, about old knowledge from pagan lands." Liesel waited. "I suggested it was not from God, that it was something to be wary of." He paused. "I said it to a congregation of people who lived in houses with iron stoves." He looked down at the floor beneath his hands, warm against his palms. "I was wrong," he said. "God has many ways of teaching his children, sometimes through Scripture, sometimes through the accumulated knowing of grandmothers passed from hand to hand across generations and across oceans. I was too proud to see that." He looked up at her. "I am asking you to forgive me." Liesel was 15 years old. She had buried both her parents within 3 weeks of each other. She had built a stove from memory and clay, while an entire county waited for her to fail. She had walked 2 miles through a blizzard to bring people home who had not believed she was worth believing in. She understood something about forgiveness that most people twice her age had not yet needed to learn, because most people twice her age had not yet been in situations that required it at this level. "There is nothing to forgive," she said. "You did not know. Now you know." Father McCready looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and placed his palm flat against the warm floor and said nothing more. Bridget Quinn and her mother arrived before midnight. Their house had lost its roof in the second night of the storm, the wind finding some weakness in the timber framing and exploiting it with the thoroughness that wind at 50 miles an hour brings to structural weaknesses. They had walked 3 miles in the dark, following what Bridget later described as a faint warmth that she had felt coming through the cracks in the tar paper walls of Liesel's shack when she was close enough. A warmth that was enough of a contrast with everything outside to navigate toward. Stellan opened the door for them. He looked at Bridget Quinn in the gray light of the shack's interior wrapped in snow-covered blankets. Her red hair frosted at the edges. Her feet that had carried her 3 miles through a blizzard without giving up. He did not say anything. He stepped aside and let her in. She looked at him as she passed, and something moved between them in that look that the storm had not created, but had perhaps clarified the way extreme conditions clarify things, stripping away whatever was decorative or provisional, and leaving only what was actually there. Nils Strand arrived at dawn on the 3rd day. He had walked 2 miles in the storm alone at 72 years old. because he wanted to see whether the stove had held through 2 full days of the worst blizzard he had experienced in 30 years on the Dakota prairie. He came through the door with ice on his mustache and the expression of a man who has made a decision and executed it and is not interested in discussing whether it was wise. He walked to the stove. He pressed his palm against the clay. He held it there. Then he turned to Liesel with the expression she had seen the first time he came in October. Standing among the rows of drying bricks, recognition. The recognition of a man who had seen this thing work 50 years ago in Bergen and had not been certain until this moment that it would work here, that it would translate, that the knowledge would survive the distance. It held, he said. Yes, Liesel said. He sat down on the floor with the deliberateness of a 72-year-old man who has been walking in a blizzard and has earned the right to sit. He said nothing more for a long time. He did not need to. By the morning of the third day, there were 9 people in the 12 by 14-foot shack. 9 people on the warm floor. 9 people who had come one by one through the white and the cold to the only room in their radius of existence that was holding against what was outside. 9 people who would have been counted differently in the final tallies if the stove had been iron. Thomas Mercer and his rescue party arrived at noon. They had been out since first light, moving across the county in the order they had determined the previous day, working from the places of most likely need toward the places of less likely need, the hierarchy determined by chimney smoke and the absence of it. They had stopped at 7 homesteads before they reached the Brower claim. 4 of those stops had been tragedies of different weights. 3 had been something else, families who had survived through combinations of luck and stubbornness and the particular tenacity that the Dakota prairie seemed to produce in people who chose to stay on it long enough. None of those 3 had anything like what Mercer found when he pushed open the door of the tar paper shack and the warmth came out against his face. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The smell of bread reached him. He had not yet processed the warmth or the 9 living people when the bread registered, because the bread was the thing that was most wrong with what he had prepared himself to find, the thing that was furthest from the expected scenario. You did not prepare yourself to find bread. You prepared yourself to find stillness and cold and the particular silence of rooms where the living had become the other thing. He stepped inside. He went to the stove. He placed his palm against it. He crouched and placed his palm against the floor. He stood up and looked at Liesel Brower, 15 years old, with flour on her hands, and an expression of calm attention, waiting for whatever came next in the way that she had been waiting for, whatever came next since Nebraska. "How much fuel did you use?" he said. "In 3 days. She pointed to the bundle of twisted grass in the corner. Approximately 1/3 of it was gone. Mercer looked at the bundle. He looked at the stove. He looked at the 9 living people on the warm floor of a 12 by 14-foot structure in the middle of the worst blizzard in the recorded history of the territory. He took out his notebook and began to write, and he wrote for a long time. And when he stopped writing, he looked up at Liesel again with the expression of a man who is holding something that he does not yet have adequate language for. He would spend the rest of his life finding that language. He would never quite finish. The days after the storm were the days of counting. The official count for what the newspapers were already calling the children's blizzard for the school children, caught in the open when it struck, would eventually reach more than 200 dead across the Great Plains. In Turner County alone, the losses were sufficient to change how people spoke about winter preparation in every subsequent year, to make certain conversations permanent that had previously been optional. Frank Geller stood in the center of Liesel's shack on the morning after the storm finally exhausted itself. He stood there for a long time looking at the stove, and then at Constance, whose hands the doctor from Freeman had examined and declared intact, the fingers preserved from what would certainly have been amputation if she had spent another night in their farmhouse. He looked at Samuel, who was sitting beside the stove with his hands against the clay, and a look on his face that Geller had not seen there before and did not yet have a name for but recognized. Then he looked at Liesel. "I called you fools," he said. His voice had the roughness of a man who has been through something and has not yet had time to smooth it back over. "I said you were building your own graves. I looked at your bricks in August and I thought I was looking at a waste of time and clay. I thought I knew better because I had lived here 16 years and you were just children." He paused. He looked at the stove. "I was wrong." He said it plainly without flourish, the way a man states a fact. We were all wrong. Every one of us who laughed or walked away or said you couldn't survive. Wrong. He put his hand on the warm clay surface. "This works. This works better than anything I have seen in 16 winters on this prairie, and you built it with your grandmother's words and your own hands and $43 and nothing else that I could see." He looked at her. "You saved my wife. You saved my son. You saved me. And I have nothing to give you in return, except the truth, which is that I will spend whatever time I have left on this earth telling people what I saw here." He was quiet for a moment. "She would be your age now," he said. "Ellie, if she had lived." He did not look away. His eyes were steady and direct and carrying more than the sentence they accompanied. Liesel understood what he was saying. She understood what the 1881 stone in the churchyard meant, and what the iron stove that had gone cold in the night had cost him, and what it meant that he was standing in this room instead of in a different version of the same story. "Then I will try to be the kind of woman she would have been," she said. Geller nodded once. He put on his hat. He walked out. They never spoke of it again. Not directly. But every time they met for the rest of his life, when he passed her in Freeman, or she rode by his farm, or they stood in the same church on the same Sunday, he looked at her in a particular way, not the general acknowledgement of neighbor to neighbor, not the courteous recognition of people who share a county, something more specific. The nod of a man who knows precisely what he was wrong about and is grateful every day of his remaining life that being wrong did not cost him everything. Cecil Holt came at the end of February. He came alone. He tied his horse at the fence post and walked across the yard and knocked on the door of the shack that he had visited the previous August and assessed in the confident shorthand of a man who had been assessing claims for 20 years as unsurvivable. The shack was still standing. The chimney above its roofline showed no smoke, as it rarely did in the middle of the day, because the middle of the day was when the clay from the previous evening's fire was still doing its work without assistance. Liesel opened the door. She stepped aside. He walked to the stove. He circled it slowly with the deliberate attention of a man conducting an official assessment, tapping a brick here and there, with his knuckle noting the sound, noting the solidity of the mortar joints, noting the whitewashed exterior, and the clean lines of the channel openings at the base. He crouched and pressed his hand against the floor for a moment. He stood. He moved to the window and made a note in his leather notebook. Then he stood near the door for a moment. His notebook closed in one hand and his pen in the other, and he looked at Liesel with an expression she had not seen on his face in their previous 2 encounters. In August, he had looked at her with the brisk, incurious dismissal of a man who has already categorized what he is seeing and has moved on to the next thing. He had looked at her the way you look at a problem that will resolve itself unpleasantly, but inevitably without requiring your further attention. He was not looking at her that way now. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something that has required him to update a significant portion of what he thought he knew when the updating has happened. But the new information has not yet been fully integrated when the arithmetic is still running. He was 50 years old, and behind his eyes, Liesel could see the particular kind of calculation that 50-year-old men perform when they are measuring the distance between what they believed in August and what they are being required to believe in February, and what that distance implies about the reliability of their judgment in general. He did not apologize. Men of his particular formation did not traffic in apology which required an acknowledgement of error that was too personal, too exposed. What they offered instead was correction, the quiet administrative revision of a record that was no longer accurate. He opened his notebook. He uncapped his pen. He wrote something. "Improvements adequate," he said. "Claim valid." He closed the notebook. He put on his hat. He went out. The door closed behind him. Liesel stood in the center of the room and looked at the closed door for a moment. 2 words, adequate and valid. Not the words she would have chosen. Not the acknowledgement that a different kind of person in a different kind of story might have waited for, might have needed, might have felt owed. But words that meant the land was theirs. Words that meant no one could reassign the claim. Words that meant the 160 acres of Dakota prairie that her father had wanted badly enough to die traveling toward were legally and permanently, and without further question, the property of the Brower family. From $43 in a cracked leather notebook, from blue-gray clay at a creek bank and straw cut from the edge of the prairie, and the precise handwriting of a woman who had wanted to give her granddaughter something useful. From 300 years of knowing that she had refused to let become just a thing from the old country, just a thing that did not apply here, just a thing that the modern world had superseded with iron and manufactured certainty, and the confident assessments of men who had never been cold enough to question their own expertise. She went back to the bread she had been making. By spring, the knowing had begun to move. Constance Geller built the first new masonry stove in April. She had spent the winter months learning what she could from watching and from asking, and from sitting on Liesel's warm floor during the final days of the blizzard, and paying attention in the specific way that a person pays attention when they understand that what they are watching is important. She came to Liesel in the early April warmth and said she was ready to try, and Liesel went with her and oversaw the laying of the first several courses and then stepped back and let Constance's hands do what Constance's hands had learned to do. It worked. Geller stood in the kitchen of his rebuilt home and pressed his palm against the warm clay and said nothing for a long time, which was how Frank Geller said everything that mattered. Dorothy Marsh came to Liesel's door in March. She stood on the step for a long moment before she knocked, which Liesel, who had seen her coming across the yard through the greased paper window, understood as the visible portion of an internal negotiation that had probably been going on for some time. Dorothy was 45 years old, and she had spent the previous summer calling the Brower children mad and spreading that conclusion through the county with the efficiency of a woman who understood how information moved in small communities. When Liesel opened the door, Dorothy looked at her with an expression that had gone through several revisions on the walk across the yard and had arrived at something that was neither the original version nor a comfortable replacement for it, but was at least honest. I said things she said. About you and your brother. About what you were building. She paused. I was wrong about everything. Her voice caught on the last word. My sister-in-law, she said. She died in the blizzard. Iron stove. It went cold on the second night, and she was 40 feet from a woodpile she couldn't reach. She looked at the floor of the shack at the packed dirt that Liesel knew was warm beneath it without needing to check. She looked up. Teach me. Please. So that no one I love ever dies that way again. Liesel stepped aside. Dorothy Marsh spent 3 weeks learning everything Liesel would teach her. She was not a natural in the way that Bridget Quinn was a natural, not immediately attuned to the tactile vocabulary of the claywork. But she was thorough, and she was motivated in the specific way that grief motivates people with a seriousness that does not require encouragement from outside, because it carries its own inexhaustible internal pressure. By the end of the 3 weeks, she could mix the clay to the right consistency, and she could lay a course of bricks with acceptable evenness, and she understood the channel geometry well enough to catch her own errors. She became, in the months that followed, the most vocal advocate for masonry stoves in Turner County. She told everyone who would listen. She organized work parties for families who could not build alone. She brought skeptics to stand in front of Liesel's stove and press their hands against the warm clay and feel for themselves what 300 years of knowing felt like on the skin. The woman who had spread gossip about madness now spread knowledge about survival, and she spread it with the same efficiency and the same persistence that she had brought to the gossip, because the mechanism was the same, only the content had changed. Carl Vogt formalized the work in the summer. He had always been a brickmaker by trade, and he brought to the spread of masonry stove construction the professional rigor of someone who understood that the difference between a good thing and a reliable thing is standardization. He refined the brick dimensions. He improved the channel geometry based on the data that the winter had provided. He trained young men to build stoves for families who wanted them, but lacked either the knowledge or the physical capacity to build their own. Walter Breck became one of his first apprentices. The young man who had stood at the edge of the Brower yard in September and bet $5 against their survival paid his debt in January without being reminded of it. He paid it without speaking about it, which was the appropriate approach and one that reflected some growth in his understanding of how the world worked. He showed up at Vogt's yard in May and said he wanted to learn the trade. He did not mention the bet. He did not need to. The count of masonry stoves in Turner County through the following winter was 17, which was more than anyone had expected, and fewer than would eventually exist. The winter after that, no one was keeping a precise count anymore, because the counting had become impractical. Stellan Brower married Bridget Quinn in the summer of 1890. He had proposed to her on a morning in May in the yard of the Brower claim, with the practicality that characterized him in everything, asking her directly, and without elaborate preamble, whether she would marry him. and she had said yes with the same directness that had characterized her from the beginning. From the first time she had walked among the rows of drying bricks in September of 1887 and asked real questions instead of forming conclusions. They had 4 children. Each child learned to mix clay before they were old enough to plow a row. Each child could recite the proportions of earth and straw and water from memory before they were 7. Bridget kept the notebook, the one with their grandmother Marta's handwriting. She added her own notes in the margins, observations from 20 Dakota winters of working with masonry stoves. Corrections to proportions that the local clay required improvements she had found through attention and error. When she died, she left the notebook to her oldest daughter. Samuel Geller had spent the years between 1888 and 1893 learning everything Liesl would teach him about masonry stove construction. He had been a serious student, the kind of student who arrives early and stays late, and asks the kind of questions that tell you he has been thinking about the previous lesson since the moment it ended. He had the hands for it, broad and careful. And he had something else that was harder to name and rarer, the capacity to feel what he was working with, to read the clay the way Liesl's grandmother had said you had to read it through touch rather than measurement. He married Liesl Brower in the summer of 1893. Father Macready officiated. He spoke in his sermon about wisdom that arrives from unexpected places, about the pride that blinds us to truth until something large enough removes the blindfold, about the courage required to trust what you have been given by the women who came before you when everything around you is advising against it. He had been thinking about these things since January of 1888. Working them into a shape that he could offer to the congregation without it costing more than he was prepared to give. By 1893, he had them in a shape that fit. Frank Geller stood beside his son at the church. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried, or if he was not a man who cried in public. But his eyes were wet, and he did not appear to feel that this required explanation or concealment. After the ceremony in the yard outside the church, he found Liesl for a moment alone. She would be your age now, he said. Ellie, if she had lived. Liesl understood. She understood the full weight of what he was saying, what it contained, what it had taken to say it. Then I will try to be the kind of woman she would have been, she said. Geller looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once the particular nod she had come to know over the years, the specific nod that was not a general acknowledgement, but a particular one. A private communication between two people who had a shared understanding that required no further language to maintain. He walked back to where his son was standing. Copper died in the winter of 1901. He was 14 years old, which was ancient for a dog of his size, and his history. A history that included one Nebraska road, one Dakota blizzard, and 14 winters during which he had served his people with a consistency and a completeness that Liesl thought on reflection no human being she had ever known had quite matched. He died on a January morning on the warm floor beside the stove in the farmhouse that had replaced the tar paper shack some years before, with his head on his paws and his eyes closed and his tail at rest. Liesl found him when she came in from the barn. She sat down on the floor beside him and put her hand on his head and stayed there for a long time. Stellan carved the headstone himself. It said simply, Copper, the best listener. They buried him under the oak tree in the front yard, in the cold Dakota January, with the stove warm in the farmhouse behind them, and the fields white in every direction. Liesl Geller born. Brower died in January of 1934. She was 62 years old. The month was appropriate. January had defined her in ways that no other month could claim had taken her parents from her and given her the worst blizzard in the territory's history, and also given her the test that proved what she had built was worth building. She died in her own bed in the farmhouse on a morning when a new storm was building in the northwest, and the windows were frosted at their edges and the fields outside were white and still. Samuel had died in 1924, 10 years before, and she had missed him every day of those 10 years in the specific daily way that you miss someone who was present in all the ordinary moments of your life and whose absence therefore makes itself felt in all those ordinary moments. Not in the large occasions, but in the small ones. The mornings, the cups of coffee, the particular quality of late afternoon light. Her children were with her. Their children were with them. The generations her grandmother had wanted to give something useful to the generations the notebook had been written for. The generations who had learned to mix clay before they could ride a horse, and who could recite the proportions from memory, and who knew that the floor was warm, not because someone had told them so, but because they had put their hands against it and felt it for themselves. The masonry stove in the kitchen was warm. Outside, the new storm was building towards something serious. The sky was the flat pewter of a Dakota January sky that has made up its mind. The wind was picking up from the northwest, which was the direction from which trouble always came. Inside, the clay held its warmth. It held it the way it had always held it. The way it had held it through the blizzard of 1888, and through every winter after that, steadily and without drama, and without requiring anything from the people around it, except that they build it right, and fire it correctly and trust that what their grandmothers had told them was true. It held it the way a thing holds something when it has been designed over 300 years of paying attention to do exactly that, and nothing less. Liesl closed her eyes. Her last words were in German. Der Boden ist warm, she said. The floor is warm. Her gravestone stands in the Freeman churchyard next to Samuel's, near the small stone that marks Ellie Geller, who died in 1881 at the age of 7, when the iron stove went cold in the night, whose death set in motion everything that came after, whose short life was the stone dropped in the water, whose rings reached further than anyone standing at that grave in 1881 could have seen or imagined. The inscription on Liesl's stone is in German and in English both. Sie wusste, wie man warm bleibt. She knew how to stay warm. The notebook passed from Bridget to her daughter, and from her daughter to her daughter, and from her daughter to her daughter. The handwriting on the pages covers 4 generations now, German and English, and the particular mix of both that comes when a language is being lived in rather than studied. The measurements are there. The channel configurations are there. The clay ratios and the firing techniques and the notes about what the local soil requires and what adjustments to make in different conditions. The knowledge is still alive, not in a museum, not in an archive, in hands that have learned it from other hands, through the direct transmission that her grandmother understood was the only reliable way to pass something this important across time. Through the willingness of generation after generation to believe that what the women before them knew was worth knowing, that wisdom does not expire because it is old, that truth does not become less true, because you have carried it a long way from home. The floor is warm. It has always been warm. It will stay warm for as long as there are people willing to build it. Right. Willing to mix the clay until it feels the way it is supposed to feel, and lay the bricks the way they are supposed to be laid, and trust the channel geometry that 300 years of cold winters and careful attention produced, and fire it the way the notebook says, and then wait and then press their hand to the floor and feel the warmth rising up, and understand that the warmth they are feeling is not just heat. It is everything that was passed down. It is a woman in Ukraine pressing her granddaughter's 11-year-old hands into wet clay on a summer morning and saying, "This is how our people outsmart the cold." It is a cracked leather notebook crossing an ocean in a canvas bag under a wagon seat. It is a 15-year-old girl standing at a creek bank in Dakota Territory with a handful of blue-gray clay her parents newly buried $43 to her name, every adult she had met telling her it could not be done. Pressing the clay between her palms, feeling what she had been taught to feel for, saying quietly in German to no one but herself in the wide, flat sky close enough,